In the quiet neighborhood of Riverside Hills, Ohio, a 73-year-old grandmother was about to discover the most painful truth about family loyalty. What began as eager anticipation for a milestone birthday celebration would end with the kind of betrayal that changes everything. My name is Margaret Davis, but everyone calls me Maggie, and I never imagined that the people I loved most would teach me the difference between blood relations and true family in the cruelest way possible. When my 75th birthday arrived with empty chairs and broken promises, I realized that sometimes the greatest gift you can give yourself is the courage to rewrite your legacy. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I had been planning my 75th birthday celebration for months, though I suppose that makes me sound more social than I actually am. The truth is, I'm not someone who throws elaborate parties or seeks attention, but 75 felt significant somehow. After Harold's passing 3 years ago, birthdays had become quiet affairs, usually just dinner with my son Robert and his family. But this year, I found myself wanting something more, something that felt like a proper celebration of the life Harold and I had built together in this house on Maple Street. The Victorian home had been our pride and joy when we bought it 42 years ago. Harold used to joke that it was too big for just the two of us, but we always imagined it filled with children and grandchildren, holiday gatherings and birthday parties. We did have Robert, though he came to us later in life, when we'd almost given up hope. Perhaps that's why I spoiled him more than I should have, this miracle child who arrived when I was 38, and Harold was 41. Robert is 47 now, married to Linda for 18 years, and they have 2 teenagers, Tyler, who just turned 17, and Ashley, who's 15. On paper, we're a close family. They live only 20 minutes away in one of those new developments with names like Heritage Oaks and Willow Creek Estates, though there's not a single Heritage Oak or Willow Creek to be found. Robert works in sales for a pharmaceutical company, does quite well for himself, and Linda manages the household with the efficiency of someone who takes pride in organization and appearances. But somewhere along the way, our family gatherings had become obligatory rather than joyful. Robert would arrive checking his phone constantly, Linda would make polite conversation while clearly calculating how soon they could leave, and the kids would sit quietly, well-behaved but distant. Still, they were my family, and I loved them fiercely, even if I sometimes felt like I was the only one working to maintain our connection. For my 75th, I decided to do something different. Instead of the usual dinner at Romano's Italian restaurant, where we'd sit in relative silence while Tyler texted under the table and Ashley picked at her food, I wanted to host a celebration at home. I envisioned the dining room table set with my good china, the one Harold and I received as a wedding gift and only used for special occasions. I planned to cook Robert's favorite pot roast, the one he used to request for every birthday when he was young, and Linda's preferred lemon cake, though I suspected she hadn't eaten a full slice of cake in years. The idea grew in my mind over several weeks. I pictured Tyler maybe bringing his guitar, the one he'd been playing since middle school, but never seemed to have time for anymore. Ashley could show me the photography project she'd mentioned working on for her art class. We could actually talk, really talk, without the background noise of a restaurant or the pressure of time constraints. It would be intimate, meaningful, the kind of gathering Harold always said made a house feel like a home. I called Robert 6 weeks before my birthday, my excitement barely contained as I explained my vision for the celebration. "Oh, Mom," he said, and I could hear the distraction in his voice, probably multitasking as usual. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. That sounds really nice. Let me check with Linda about the date and get back to you. When he called back 2 days later, his enthusiasm matched mine, or seemed to. "Linda thinks it's a wonderful idea," he said. "The kids are excited too. It's been too long since we had a real family celebration at the house." We settled on Saturday afternoon, 2 o'clock, which would give me time to prepare properly and them time to stay for dinner if they wanted. Over the following weeks, I threw myself into planning with an energy I hadn't felt since Harold's retirement party. I had the house deep cleaned, hired someone to wash the windows so the afternoon light would stream in perfectly, and even had the dining room wallpaper touched up where it had started to peel near the corner window. The florist downtown helped me choose arrangements that would complement the antique china without overwhelming the table, and I spent an entire afternoon polishing the silver serving pieces that had belonged to Harold's grandmother. The menu planning became a labor of love. In addition to the pot roast and lemon cake, I decided to make Harold's famous cornbread dressing, the recipe he'd perfected over 20 years of Thanksgiving dinners. I would prepare roasted vegetables from the garden I'd maintained, despite my arthritis making the work more difficult each year. For appetizers, I planned the stuffed mushrooms that had always been a hit at our holiday gatherings, and I even ordered a special wine that Robert had mentioned enjoying at a work event. 3 weeks before the celebration, I called to confirm the details and see if there was anything special the kids might want. "Everything sounds perfect, Mom," Robert assured me. "We're all looking forward to it. Tyler's been practicing some new songs on his guitar, and Ashley finished that photography project you asked about. It's going to be really special." The confirmation filled me with a warmth I hadn't experienced since Harold's death. This was what family was supposed to feel like, I thought. Connection, anticipation, shared joy in simple pleasures. I began to imagine this becoming an annual tradition, maybe expanding to include some of our longtime neighbors who had become like extended family over the decades. Patricia Williams and her 2 children had moved into the duplex across the street about 8 months ago, and I'd grown fond of them through small interactions. Patricia worked 2 jobs, one at Henderson's Grocery during the day, and cleaning offices downtown 3 evenings a week. Despite her exhausting schedule, she always had time for a friendly wave or a quick conversation when we encountered each other at the mailbox. Her son Alex, who was 16, had helped me carry groceries when he noticed me struggling with the bags after a particularly long shopping trip. Her daughter Emma, who was 14, had the most beautiful singing voice I'd ever heard from someone so young. Sometimes in the evenings when my windows were open, I could hear her practicing scales or working through songs, and it reminded me of the music Harold and I used to play in our living room during the early years of our marriage. I'd been thinking about inviting the Williams family to join us for dessert, maybe creating an opportunity for Tyler and Ashley to meet some local kids their age. Alex seemed like the kind of responsible, respectful young man that might be a good influence on Tyler, who'd been struggling with motivation in school lately. And Emma's passion for music might inspire Ashley to rediscover some of her own creative interests. But I decided to keep the celebration focused on family first. There would be time to expand our circle later, I told myself. This birthday was about rebuilding the connections that had grown loose over the years, about creating new memories in the house that held so many precious ones. 2 weeks before the birthday, I called again, this time with specific questions about timing and dietary restrictions. Linda had developed what she called food sensitivities over the past year, which seemed to change monthly, but always required careful accommodation. "Actually, Mom," Robert said, and something in his tone made me pause in my note-taking. "Linda's been feeling a bit overwhelmed lately with Tyler's college prep and Ashley's activities. Would it be possible to maybe do something a little more low-key?" The suggestion confused me. "What do you mean by low-key?" I asked. "I thought we could just have a nice family dinner, nothing too elaborate." Right, he said quickly. "I just meant maybe we could do our usual thing at Romano's instead. You know how much work hosting can be, and we don't want you exhausting yourself for your birthday." The disappointment was sharp and immediate. "Robert, I want to cook for you," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I want us to spend real time together, not just an hour at a restaurant table. When was the last time we actually sat in my living room and talked?" "Mom, you're right," he said, and his tone shifted back to the enthusiasm I'd heard weeks earlier. "I'm sorry, that was Linda being practical, but you're absolutely right. This is your 75th birthday, and if you want to celebrate at home, that's exactly what we should do. Consider it confirmed." The conversation left me feeling unsettled, though I couldn't quite identify why. There had been something perfunctory about Robert's final agreement, as if he were humoring me rather than sharing my excitement. But I pushed the feeling aside and continued with my preparations, choosing to focus on the joy I felt when I imagined the afternoon unfolding exactly as I'd planned. 1 week before the celebration, I called to finalize the timing and see if they needed directions to any dish they might want to bring. "Oh, Mom, you don't need to cook everything yourself," Linda said when she answered the phone. "Why don't we bring the salad and maybe some rolls from that bakery Tyler likes?" It was the first time Linda had answered when I called about the party, and her tone was warm and engaged in a way that reassured me. We spent 20 minutes discussing menu details, and she seemed genuinely interested in the family recipes I planned to prepare. She even asked about the story behind Harold's cornbread dressing, which led to a lovely conversation about family traditions and the importance of passing down recipes through generations. Tyler and Ashley are really excited, she told me. Tyler's been practicing Blue Moon, that song you and Harold used to dance to in the kitchen. Ashley found some old photographs she wants to show you, including some she took of the house from across the street. She's gotten really interested in architectural photography lately. The conversation filled me with such happiness that I found myself humming while I prepared the guest bathroom with fresh towels and the good hand soap that smelled like lavender. Everything was falling into place exactly as I'd hoped. 3 days before my birthday, I made a final grocery run, carefully checking my list twice to ensure I hadn't forgotten anything. At Henderson's Grocery, I ran into Patricia Williams, who was restocking the produce section during what must have been her lunch break. She looked tired, the kind of bone-deep exhaustion that comes from working too many hours with too little rest. But her smile was genuine when she saw me. "Mrs. Davis," she said, setting down a box of lettuce to give me her full attention. "How are you doing? I've been meaning to stop by and thank you for the tomatoes you left on our porch last week. Alex made the most amazing pasta sauce with them." "Please call me Maggie," I said, as I had several times before. "And those tomatoes were just going to waste if someone didn't use them." I'm glad Alex enjoyed cooking with them. "He's become quite the chef lately," Patricia said with obvious pride. "Says he wants to study culinary arts after high school, maybe work his way up to owning a restaurant someday. Emma thinks he should go to college first, get a business degree to go with the cooking skills." The conversation reminded me of the college discussions Harold and I used to have about Robert's future. Though those had been different somehow, we'd focused on practical considerations, financial security, choosing a safe path rather than pursuing passionate interests. Maybe that's why Robert seemed to approach his work with competence but not joy. "Speaking of Emma," I said, "I've been enjoying her singing practice in the evenings. She has a remarkable voice." Patricia's face lit up with maternal pride mixed with concern. "She's talented, that's for sure. But voice lessons are expensive, and there's no music program at the public school anymore. She practices with YouTube videos mostly, teaches herself from online tutorials. Sometimes I worry she's not getting the proper training she deserves." The information stuck with me as I finished my shopping and drove home. Here was a family with limited resources but unlimited determination. Parents and children supporting each other's dreams, even when the path forward wasn't clear. The contrast with my own family's approach to Tyler and Ashley's interests was striking. My grandchildren had access to every advantage, every opportunity, but seemed to lack the passion and drive that Emma and Alex displayed naturally. 2 days before my birthday, I spent the afternoon preparing dishes that could be made ahead of time. The stuffed mushrooms were assembled and ready to bake, the cornbread for the dressing was cooling on the counter, and I'd prepared the marinade for the pot roast. The house smelled like the holidays, warm and inviting, filled with the aromas of home cooking and family traditions. That evening, I called Robert one final time to confirm the timing and see if there were any last-minute changes. "All set for Saturday at 2, he said cheerfully. "We're really looking forward to it, Mom. It's going to be a wonderful celebration." "Should I plan on you staying for dinner, or did you want to keep it to just the afternoon?" I asked, hoping they might choose to extend the visit. "Let's play it by ear," Robert said. "We might stay if the kids don't have any evening plans. You know how weekends can be with teenagers." The non-commitment disappointed me slightly, but I understood the challenges of scheduling with adolescents. At least they were coming, I told myself. At least we would have the afternoon together, a chance to reconnect and create new memories in the house that held so many precious ones. Friday evening, I set the dining room table with my wedding china, carefully arranging the pieces I'd polished earlier in the week. The late afternoon sunlight streamed through the clean windows, illuminating the floral pattern on the plates and casting warm shadows across the mahogany table Harold had inherited from his parents. Everything looked perfect, elegant but welcoming, formal enough to honor the occasion but comfortable enough for genuine conversation. I went to bed that night filled with anticipation, imagining the next day's conversations and the joy of watching my family enjoy the meal I'd prepared with such care. In my mind, I could see Tyler playing his guitar in the living room while Ashley showed off her photographs, Linda and I working together in the kitchen to prepare the final dishes, and Robert relaxing in Harold's old chair, finally taking a break from the constant pressure of work and responsibility. It would be perfect, I told myself as I drifted off to sleep. After 3 years of quiet birthdays and increasingly distant family gatherings, we would finally reconnect in the way I'd been hoping for since Harold's death. Tomorrow would mark not just my 75th birthday, but the beginning of a new chapter in our family's story, one where love and attention replaced obligation and duty. I had no way of knowing that tomorrow would indeed mark a new chapter, but not at all the one I'd been anticipating. Sometimes the most devastating lessons come wrapped in the most innocent expectations, and sometimes the people we trust most are the ones who teach us the hardest truths about love, loyalty, and the difference between family by blood and family by choice. Saturday morning arrived with the kind of crisp October sunshine that made everything look more beautiful than usual. I woke up at 6:30, earlier than necessary but too excited to sleep longer. Today was my 75th birthday, and for the first time since Harold's death, I felt genuinely hopeful about what the day would bring. I made coffee in my favorite mug, the one Tyler had given me for Mother's Day when he was 12, painted with slightly crooked letters spelling "World's Best Grandma." Standing at the kitchen window, I could see the Williams house across the street, where Patricia was already loading her car for her Saturday shift at Henderson's grocery. Even from this distance, I could see the exhaustion in her movements, but she paused to wave when she noticed me in the window. Such a lovely woman, I thought, working so hard to provide for her children while maintaining that genuine warmth that seemed to touch everyone she encountered. The pot roast needed to go into the oven by 10:30 to be perfectly tender by 2 o'clock, so I spent the early morning hours on final preparations. I arranged the fresh flowers I'd picked up yesterday, white chrysanthemums and yellow roses that complemented the autumn colors I'd chosen for the table. The good silverware caught the morning light streaming through the dining room windows, and everything looked exactly as I'd envisioned during those weeks of planning. By 9 o'clock, I was sliding the stuffed mushrooms into the refrigerator and checking my timeline one final time. The vegetables were prepped and ready for roasting, the lemon cake sat under its glass dome looking picture-perfect, and the house smelled like a combination of fresh flowers and the lingering aroma of yesterday's baking. I felt proud of what I'd accomplished, proud of the celebration I was creating for the people I loved most. I decided to call Robert around 10, just to confirm they were still planning to arrive at 2, and see if there was anything I could do to make the day special for the grandchildren. The phone rang several times before Linda answered, and something in her voice immediately caught my attention. "Oh, Maggie," she said, and I could hear what sounded like hurried movement in the background. "Happy birthday! How are you feeling today?" "Wonderful," I replied, unable to contain my enthusiasm. "Everything's coming together perfectly here. Is everyone excited about this afternoon?" There was a pause that lasted just a moment too long. "About this afternoon," Linda began, and my heart did a small skip of concern. "I'm so sorry, but we're dealing with a bit of a situation over here." "What kind of situation?" I asked, setting down the wooden spoon I'd been using to check the pot roast seasoning. "Tyler got himself into some trouble last night," she explained, her voice carrying the stressed tone of a mother dealing with teenage crisis. "He was at a party that got broken up by the police, and while he wasn't arrested or anything serious like that, Robert feels we need to address this immediately. You know how important it is to handle these things right away before they escalate." The disappointment hit me like cold water, but I tried to keep my voice understanding. "Of course, that sounds serious. But couldn't you handle that conversation this morning and still come for the birthday celebration? It's already 10 o'clock. "Well, that's just it," Linda continued, and I could hear Robert's voice in the background, though I couldn't make out the words. "Robert thinks we should use this as a teaching moment, you know. Make Tyler spend the day doing community service or volunteer work instead of enjoying a family party. Show him that actions have consequences." "I see," I said slowly, trying to process this information. "And Ashley? Surely she doesn't need to be punished for her brother's poor choices." "You're absolutely right," Linda agreed quickly. "But she has that photography workshop at the community center today, the one she's been looking forward to for weeks. It's from 1 to 5, and you know how passionate she's become about her art. I'd hate for her to miss it." The explanations felt reasonable individually, but together they created a picture I didn't want to acknowledge. "So you're saying none of you can come today?" "I'm so sorry, Maggie," Linda said, and she did sound genuinely apologetic. "I know how much work you put into planning this, and we feel terrible about the timing. But you understand, don't you? Sometimes family responsibilities have to take priority over celebrations." The irony of that statement wasn't lost on me. Family responsibilities taking priority over family celebrations. "What about tomorrow?" I asked, grasping for alternatives. "Or next weekend? We could reschedule." "Let me talk to Robert and check our calendar," Linda said. "I know next weekend is really busy with Tyler's college prep activities and Ashley's school commitments, but maybe we can work something out." The conversation ended with vague promises to reschedule and repeated apologies about the timing. I hung up the phone and stood in my kitchen, surrounded by the evidence of hours of preparation, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The pot roast was already in the oven, the table was set with my wedding china, and I had enough food prepared to feed 8 people. But instead of a family celebration, I would be spending my 75th birthday alone. The rational part of my mind understood that emergencies happen, that parenting sometimes requires difficult decisions that disrupt plans. Tyler's situation did sound serious, and Robert was right to address it immediately. Ashley's photography workshop was an opportunity she'd been anticipating, and supporting her artistic development was important. These were reasonable conflicts that any family might face. But another part of my mind, a part one tried to keep quiet, whispered that this felt familiar. How many times over the years had our plans been canceled or postponed due to Robert's work commitments, Linda's social obligations, or the children's activities? How often had I rearranged my schedule, modified my expectations, or simply accepted disappointment because something else took priority? I called Patricia Williams without fully realizing I was going to do it. Her phone went straight to voicemail, which made sense since she was working her Saturday shift at the grocery store. I left a brief message wishing her a good day and asking her to call when she had time, though I wasn't entirely sure why I felt the need to reach out to her in this moment. Instead of dwelling on my disappointment, I decided to salvage what I could of the day. The pot roast would still be delicious tomorrow, and I could freeze portions for easy meals over the next few weeks. The cake would keep perfectly for several days, and the flowers would brighten my house whether I had guests or not. I was a practical woman who had weathered much more serious disappointments than a canceled birthday party. But as I moved through the motions of adjusting my preparations, I found myself thinking about the conversations I'd had with Robert and Linda over the past several weeks. Their enthusiasm had seemed genuine, their commitment to the celebration had appeared solid, and yet this morning's phone call had felt almost relief-laden, as if they'd been looking for an excuse to cancel. Around noon, I decided to take a walk through the neighborhood, partly for exercise and partly to clear my head. The October air was perfect, cool enough to be refreshing but warm enough to be comfortable, and the maple trees lining Maple Street were showing off their autumn colors in spectacular fashion. Several neighbors were working in their yards, and I exchanged pleasantries with the Hendersons, who were raking leaves, and Mrs. Chen, who was planting bulbs for spring flowers. When I reached the end of our street, I turned around and looked back at my house from a distance. It looked beautiful in the afternoon light, well-maintained and welcoming, the kind of home that should be filled with family gatherings and celebration. But I could also see it as others might, as a large house occupied by a single elderly woman, who perhaps expected too much from busy adult children with their own lives and responsibilities. On my way back home, I encountered Alex Williams walking toward the duplex with a bag of groceries. He smiled when he saw me and waited for me to catch up, showing the kind of respect for elders that seemed increasingly rare among teenagers. "Happy birthday, Mrs. Davis," he said, and I was surprised that he knew about my birthday. "My mom mentioned you were having a family celebration today. I hope it's wonderful." "Thank you, Alex," I replied, touched that Patricia had remembered and mentioned it to her children. "How did you know it was my birthday?" "Mom keeps track of things like that," he explained with obvious affection for his mother. "She says it's important to pay attention to the people in your life, especially when they might not have many people paying attention to them." The comment was innocent, delivered without any awareness of how accurately it described my current situation, but it hit me with unexpected force. Here was a 16-year-old boy whose mother worked 2 jobs and struggled to make ends meet, yet she had noticed and remembered my birthday while my own family had found reasons to avoid celebrating it. "Are you cooking something special for your celebration?" Alex asked, shifting the grocery bag to his other arm. "I was," I said, then corrected myself. "I am." The plans changed a bit, but I still have a lovely meal prepared. "That's great," he said with genuine enthusiasm. "Family celebrations are the best. We don't get to have them very often because Mom works so much, but when we do, they're really special." As I watched Alex walk toward his house, I found myself thinking about the difference between his family situation and mine. Patricia worked constantly to provide for her children, yet Alex spoke about their rare family celebrations with appreciation and joy. My family had every advantage, every opportunity to spend time together, yet our gatherings had become obligations rather than celebrations. Back in my house, I checked on the pot roast and found it perfectly tender and aromatic. The vegetables were ready to go into the oven, the table still looked beautiful with its carefully arranged place settings, and everything was exactly as I'd planned. Except for the people who were supposed to share it with me. I considered calling Robert back, perhaps suggesting that they come for a late lunch or early dinner instead of the originally planned 2 o'clock gathering. But something stopped me from reaching for the phone. Maybe it was Alex's comment about his mother paying attention to people who might not have many people paying attention to them. Maybe it was the growing realization that I had been working much harder to maintain our family relationships than anyone else involved. Instead, I decided to set the table for one, using the everyday dishes instead of the wedding china. But as I began removing the good plates and silverware, I found myself stopping mid-motion. Why should I eat this meal from ordinary dishes, just because I was eating it alone? Why shouldn't I use the beautiful china and silverware that had been sitting in my cupboard waiting for special occasions? I left the table exactly as I'd set it, with 4 place settings using the good dishes, the polished silverware, and the fresh flower arrangements. If this was going to be my 75th birthday celebration, then I was going to celebrate properly, even if I was celebrating alone. At 2 o'clock, the time when Robert and his family should have been arriving, I served myself the pot roast dinner I'd spent days planning. I used the good serving pieces, lit the candles I'd placed on the table, and even opened the special wine I'd ordered for the occasion. The meal was delicious, everything perfectly prepared, and beautifully presented. But as I sat alone at my dining room table, surrounded by empty chairs and unused place settings, I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted in my understanding of my family relationships. This wasn't just about a canceled birthday party or a scheduling conflict. This was about patterns of behavior that I'd been accepting for years without fully acknowledging their meaning. After dinner, I called Robert's house again, thinking perhaps they'd resolved Tyler's situation and might be available for an evening visit. The call went to voicemail, which seemed odd for a Saturday evening when they should have been home dealing with their family crisis. I left a brief message saying I hoped everything was going well and that I'd enjoyed the birthday meal, even though they couldn't join me. It wasn't until Sunday morning that Robert called me back. "Mom, I'm so sorry about yesterday," he said, his voice carrying what sounded like genuine regret. "How was your birthday?" "I hope you found a way to enjoy it despite our family emergency." "It was fine," I said, though fine seemed an inadequate description of the complex emotions I'd experienced. "How did things go with Tyler? I hope you were able to work through whatever happened." "Oh, you know teenagers," Robert said with a dismissive laugh. "It turned out to be less serious than we initially thought. Just teenage poor judgment, nothing that won't be forgotten in a week or 2. The casualness of his response confused me. "But yesterday Linda said it was serious enough that you needed to spend the entire day addressing it." "Right, well, you know how these things go," Robert replied, and I could hear the distraction creeping back into his voice. Sometimes what seems like a crisis, in the moment turns out to be not such a big deal after all. "And Ashley's photography workshop?" I asked. "What about it? How did it go?" "Linda said it was from 1 to 5 yesterday." There was a pause that lasted just a moment too long. Oh, that? Actually, I think that got rescheduled or something. You know how these community center programs can be, always changing dates and times. The inconsistencies in Robert's explanations were becoming impossible to ignore. Yesterday's family emergency had apparently resolved itself so easily that he'd forgotten the details, and Ashley's important photography workshop had somehow been rescheduled without advance notice. Either my son was dealing with an unusually complicated series of coincidences, or he was lying to me about the reasons for canceling our celebration. Robert, I said carefully, I need to ask you something directly. Did you and your family actually want to come to my birthday celebration yesterday? Of course we did, Mom, he said quickly. We were all looking forward to it. It's just that sometimes life gets in the way of our plans, you know. But if you were looking forward to it, and Tyler's situation wasn't as serious as you thought, and Ashley's workshop was rescheduled, why didn't you call yesterday afternoon to see if we could still get together? The question hung in the air between us, and I could hear Robert struggling to formulate a response that would make sense. It was a complicated day, Mom. By the time we sorted everything out, it seemed too late to call and change plans again. Too late at what time? I pressed gently. I was home all day. I would have been happy to see you at any time. I don't remember exactly what time it was, Robert said, his voice taking on a slightly defensive edge. Look, Mom, I'm sorry the timing didn't work out. These things happen. Can't we just plan something for next weekend instead? But I was beginning to understand that next weekend would likely bring its own series of complications and cancellations, just as this weekend had, just as so many weekends before had. The pattern was becoming clear to me in a way it never had before, perhaps because I'd never been forced to sit alone at a table set for 5, surrounded by the evidence of my own hopeful preparations and their complete disregard. Robert, I said quietly, I spent weeks planning this celebration. I called multiple times to confirm details, prepared your favorite foods, set the table with my wedding china, and arranged my entire weekend around spending time with my family. I know, Mom, and we appreciate all the effort you put in. That's why we feel so bad about having to cancel. But here's what I don't understand, I continued. If you really felt bad about canceling, if you really appreciated the effort I put in, why does it seem like you were almost relieved to have an excuse not to come? The directness of my question clearly caught Robert off guard. He was quiet for several seconds before responding. That's not fair, Mom. You're reading things into the situation that aren't there. Am I? I asked. Because from my perspective, it feels like spending an afternoon with your mother has become such a burden that you'll use any excuse to avoid it. That's ridiculous, Robert said, but his tone lacked conviction. You're my mother. Of course I want to spend time with you. When was the last time you visited me when you didn't need something? I asked. When was the last time you called just to see how I was doing, not because you had news to share or a favor to ask? The questions were harder than I'd intended them to be, but once I started asking them, I couldn't seem to stop. Years of accumulated disappointment and unexamined hurt were rising to the surface, demanding acknowledgement. Mom, I think you're overreacting, Robert said. One canceled birthday party doesn't mean we don't care about you. It's not about one canceled party, I replied. It's about a pattern of behavior that I've been ignoring because it was easier than confronting it. What pattern of behavior? The pattern where your family only makes time for me when it's convenient for you, where our plans are always secondary to whatever else might come up, where I work harder to maintain our relationship than you do. Robert was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a note of irritation I hadn't heard before. Mom, I have a job, a wife, 2 teenagers, and about a dozen different responsibilities pulling me in different directions every day. I'm doing the best I can to balance everything, and that includes spending time with you. But spending time with me shouldn't feel like a burden that needs to be balanced against other responsibilities, I said. It should feel like something you want to do because you love me and enjoy my company. Of course I love you, Robert said, but even that declaration sounded automatic rather than heartfelt. Loving someone and enjoying their company are 2 different things, I replied. And I'm beginning to think that while you might love me out of obligation, you don't actually enjoy spending time with me. The conversation ended with awkward promises to reschedule. and Robert's insistence that I was misinterpreting their behavior. But after I hung up the phone, I found myself sitting in Harold's old chair, looking out at the street where normal families were enjoying normal Sunday activities, and wondering how my relationship with my son had become so strained without my fully realizing it. Patricia Williams was loading her children into their old sedan, probably heading to church or some family activity that required working around her demanding schedule. Even from this distance, I could see the easy affection between the three of them, the way Alex held the car door for his mother and Emma leaned over to whisper something that made them all laugh. That evening, I made a decision that surprised me with its clarity. I was going to stop working so hard to maintain relationships with people who didn't seem to value my effort. I was going to stop making excuses for behavior that consistently left me feeling disappointed and unimportant. And I was going to start paying attention to the people in my life who actually seemed to appreciate my presence. But first, I was going to take a good hard look at my will and consider whether the people I was planning to leave my estate to were the same people who would actually miss me when I was gone. Monday morning brought with it a peculiar sense of liberation that I hadn't expected. After 3 years of moving through my days with the heavy weight of grief and loneliness, I woke up feeling oddly energized. The birthday debacle had crystallized something that had been building in my mind for months, perhaps even years. I was tired of being disappointed by people who seemed to view my love as an inconvenience rather than a gift. I had spent Sunday evening reviewing my will, a document I hadn't looked at since Harold's death 3 years ago. The provisions were straightforward. Everything to Robert, with provisions for Tyler and Ashley's education if something happened to their father. The house, Harold's life insurance money that remained untouched in savings, my modest but carefully managed investment portfolio, and various personal items accumulated over 47 years of marriage. It represented a lifetime of careful saving and prudent financial management, probably worth close to $800,000 in total. The question that kept running through my mind was simple. Did Robert deserve this inheritance? More importantly, would receiving it make him a better person or simply enable him to continue treating people as disposable when more interesting opportunities arose? I decided to take a walk around the neighborhood, something I'd been doing more frequently since Harold's death. The morning air was crisp, with the promise of winter, and the maple trees were dropping their golden leaves in lazy spirals that reminded me of confetti after a celebration nobody had bothered to attend. As I rounded the corner onto Elm Street, I noticed Patricia Williams' car in the driveway of the duplex. It was unusual to see her home at this time on a Monday morning, and as I got closer, I could see her sitting on the front steps with her head in her hands. Even from a distance, her posture spoke of exhaustion and despair. I approached carefully, not wanting to intrude on what might be a private moment of difficulty. "Patricia?" I called softly when I was close enough that she could hear me without my having to raise my voice. She looked up, and I was shocked to see that she'd been crying. Her usual bright demeanor was nowhere to be found, replaced by the hollow expression of someone dealing with overwhelming stress. "Oh, Maggie," she said, quickly wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "I'm sorry, I didn't hear you coming." "Don't apologize," I said, settling beside her on the concrete steps without being invited. "What's wrong? Can I help?" Patricia shook her head, but not in a dismissive way. More like someone who had given up hope that help was possible. "I got laid off from the grocery store," she said quietly. "Budget cuts. They're eliminating 3 positions, and since I was one of the more recent hires, I was first to go." The news hit me like a physical blow. Patricia worked so hard, juggled 2 jobs while raising 2 teenagers alone, and had never once complained about her circumstances. The unfairness of it made me angry in a way that surprised me with its intensity. "When did this happen?" I asked. "Friday afternoon," she replied. "They called me into the office at the end of my shift and gave me 2 weeks' severance pay. Said they appreciated my work ethic but couldn't afford to keep me on." Friday afternoon. While I had been setting my table with wedding china and anticipating a family celebration, Patricia had been losing one of the 2 jobs that kept her family afloat. The timing seemed cruelly ironic. "What about the office cleaning job?" I asked. "That's only 3 nights a week, and it barely covers our rent," Patricia said. "Without the grocery store income, I can't make ends meet. I've been sitting here trying to figure out how to tell Alex and Emma that we might have to move. Find someplace cheaper, maybe in a different school district. The thought of losing the Williams family from the neighborhood created an unexpected sense of panic in my chest. Over the past 8 months, they had become the bright spot in my daily routine. Alex's respectful greetings when he saw me working in my garden, Emma's beautiful voice drifting across the street during her evening practice sessions, Patricia's genuine warmth whenever we encountered each other at the mailbox or the grocery store. They had become more like family to me than my actual family had been. "Have you applied for other jobs?" I asked, though I knew the question was probably naive. Someone like Patricia would have started looking for alternatives the moment she received her termination notice. "I've been filling out applications since Saturday," she said. "But most places want someone who can work days, and I can't give up the cleaning job because at least it's guaranteed income. It's a catch-22. I need day work to replace the grocery store income, but I can't take day work because I need the night work to survive." As we sat together on those concrete steps, I found myself really seeing Patricia's life for the first time. She was 34 years old, only 13 years older than my grandson Tyler, yet she carried responsibilities that would challenge someone twice her age. She was raising 2 remarkable children, essentially on her own, while working multiple jobs to keep them housed and fed and enrolled in activities that nurtured their considerable talents. "Tell me about Alex and Emma," I said, partly because I was genuinely curious, and partly because I wanted to give Patricia a chance to focus on something positive. Her face immediately brightened, the way parents' faces do when they talk about their children's accomplishments. "Alex is incredible," she said with obvious pride. "He's been cooking dinner 3 nights a week since he was 14, not because I asked him to, but because he saw how tired I was when I came home from work. He researches recipes online and makes grocery lists to help me budget better. Last month, he figured out how to make a week's worth of meals for under $30. And he wants to be a chef?" I asked, remembering our conversation from Saturday. "His dream is to open a restaurant someday," Patricia confirmed. "But he's practical about it. He knows he needs business education along with culinary training. He's already researching community college programs that offer both. The kid has more focus and determination than most adults I know." "What about Emma?" "Emma is pure talent," Patricia said, and her voice took on the wondering tone of someone still amazed by their good fortune. "She taught herself to read music using library books when she was 8 years old. She practices every single day, never because I tell her to, but because she genuinely loves it. Last spring, she auditioned for the church choir, and they gave her a solo part even though she was younger than anyone else they'd ever selected. I hear her practicing sometimes in the evenings," I admitted. "She has the most beautiful voice." "She dreams of studying music in college," Patricia continued, "maybe becoming a music teacher or a performer, but voice lessons cost $60 an hour, and music programs at universities are expensive. Sometimes I lie awake at night wondering if I'm failing her by not being able to provide the training she deserves." The conversation was giving me insight into a family that faced challenges my own family couldn't even imagine, yet approached those challenges with grace and mutual support that put my privileged relatives to shame. Here were teenagers who helped their mother without being asked, who pursued their dreams while understanding financial limitations, who treated education as an opportunity rather than an obligation. "Patricia," I said carefully, "can I ask you something personal?" She nodded, though her expression grew slightly guarded. "Your children seem remarkably mature and responsible for their ages. How did you manage to raise them that way, especially given all the challenges you faced?" Patricia was quiet for a moment, considering her answer. "I think adversity can either make people bitter or make them stronger," she said finally. "Harold and I decided early on that we weren't going to let our circumstances define our character. We taught Alex and Emma that everyone faces difficulties, but how you respond to those difficulties determines what kind of person you become." "Harold?" I asked, confused. "My ex-husband," Patricia clarified. "He left when Emma was 9 and Alex was 11. Said he wasn't cut out for the responsibility of family life, that he needed to, quote, find himself or some such nonsense. The kids were devastated, but after the initial shock wore off, We all agreed we were better off without someone who viewed his own children as burdens. The parallel to my own situation was so obvious it made me uncomfortable. Patricia's husband had abandoned his family when they needed him most, just as Robert seemed to avoid me whenever possible. The difference was that Patricia and her children had grown stronger from the experience, while I had spent years making excuses for behavior that consistently left me feeling unvalued. "How do you maintain such a positive attitude?" I asked. "Doesn't it ever make you angry that life has been so much harder than it should have been?" "Of course it does," Patricia admitted. "But staying angry takes energy I don't have. I'd rather use that energy to build something better for my kids and myself." We sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, watching the autumn leaves drift down from the maple tree that shaded both our properties. I was thinking about the contrast between Patricia's approach to adversity and my own tendency to enable behavior that made my relationships worse rather than better. "Patricia," I said eventually, "what if someone offered to help you through this transition, just temporarily until you found another job?" "That's kind of you to offer," she said, "but I couldn't accept charity. Alex and Emma and I have always made our own way, and I want to keep it that way." "What if it wasn't charity?" I asked. "What if it was an investment in people who deserved support?" Patricia studied my face with the careful attention of someone trying to understand a complicated proposition. "What do you mean?" "I mean that some people use help to become stronger and more self-sufficient, while other people use help as an excuse to avoid taking responsibility for their own lives. You strike me as someone who would use assistance to build something better, not as a crutch to avoid effort." "Maggie, you barely know us," Patricia said gently. "We've been neighbors for 8 months, but we've probably had fewer than a dozen real conversations." "That's true," I agreed. "But in those conversations, and in watching how your family interacts, I've learned more about your character than I've learned about some people I've known for decades." Patricia looked confused, and I realized my comment probably sounded cryptic. How could I explain that watching her children treat her with genuine affection and respect had highlighted everything that was missing from my own family relationships? "Let me ask you this," I said. "If someone gave you enough money to cover your expenses for 6 months while you looked for better employment, what would you do with that opportunity?" "I'd find a job that used my skills better," Patricia answered without hesitation. "I have an associate degree in accounting, but I haven't been able to find work in that field because most offices want someone with recent experience. 6 months would give me time to take some refresher courses and maybe volunteer with a nonprofit to rebuild my resume." "And what about Alex and Emma? How would they use that kind of stability?" "Alex could focus on his studies instead of worrying about whether we'll have to move," Patricia said, her voice growing stronger as she talked about possibilities rather than problems. "Emma could maybe take some voice lessons, or at least join the community theater group she's been interested in but couldn't afford." "Those sound like investments that would pay long-term dividends," I observed. "They would be," Patricia agreed. "But Maggie, I can't accept that kind of help from you. It wouldn't be right." "Why not?" "Because you don't owe us anything. We're not your responsibility." "No," I said. "You're not my responsibility. But you could be my choice." The distinction seemed to surprise her. "What's the difference?" "Responsibility implies obligation," I explained. "Choice implies affection. I'm tired of feeling obligated to people who don't seem to appreciate my effort. I'd rather choose to support people who would value the opportunity and use it wisely." Patricia was quiet for a long time, processing what I'd said. "Are you talking about your son?" she asked finally. The question was more perceptive than I'd expected. "What makes you ask that?" "Alex mentioned that you had a family celebration planned for your birthday," Patricia said carefully. "He was excited about it because he thought it was nice that you had people who wanted to celebrate with you. When I saw you yesterday, you seemed disappointed about something, and he wondered if the celebration hadn't gone as planned." The fact that Alex had been paying attention to my emotional state, had cared enough to worry about whether my birthday had been enjoyable, brought tears to my eyes. Here was a 16-year-old boy who was more attuned to my well-being than my own son had been. "The celebration was canceled," I said simply. "Last-minute family emergency that turned out to be not much of an emergency after all." "I'm sorry," Patricia said, and something in her tone suggested she understood more than I'd explicitly shared. That must have been very disappointing. It was, I admitted, but it was also clarifying. Sometimes you need to be disappointed by people to understand what your relationship with them really is. And what did you understand about your relationship with your son? The question was direct but not intrusive, asked with the kind of genuine concern that invited honesty rather than defensiveness. I understood that I've been working much harder to maintain our relationship than he has, I said, and that my love and attention have become things he takes for granted rather than treasures. That's a painful realization, Patricia said softly. Yes, but it's also liberating, I replied. Because once you stop expecting people to treat you better than they're capable of treating you, you can start focusing on people who actually do treat you well. We talked for another hour, sitting on those concrete steps while the morning grew warmer around us. Patricia told me more about Alex's culinary ambitions and Emma's musical talent. I shared stories about Harold and the life we'd built together in the house across the street. The conversation flowed naturally, without the careful navigation required when talking to Robert and his family, without the sense that I was imposing on someone's valuable time. When Patricia finally stood to go inside and continue her job search, I made a decision that felt both impulsive and completely logical. Patricia, I said, I want you to think about something. I'm going to make you an offer, and I want you to consider it seriously before you say no. She waited, her expression curious but cautious. I want to help you and your children through this transition, I said. Not as charity, but as an investment in people I believe in. Let me cover your basic expenses for 6 months while you find work that matches your skills and education. Use the time to build something better for your family. Maggie, I can't. Before you say no, I interrupted gently, think about Alex and Emma. Think about what 6 months of stability could mean for their futures. Think about the voice lessons Emma could take, the college preparation Alex could focus on instead of worrying about money. Patricia's eyes filled with tears again, but these looked different from the tears of despair I'd seen earlier. Why would you do this for us? Because you're the kind of people who deserve support, I said. Because your children treat you with love and respect. Because you've raised them to care about others. Because you face difficulties with dignity instead of blame. And because, I added, surprising myself with the honesty, spending time with your family makes me feel valued in a way I haven't felt in years. That afternoon, I called James Peterson, the lawyer who had handled Harold's estate, and had been encouraging me to update my will. James, I said when he answered the phone, I need to schedule an appointment to make some changes to my will. Of course, Maggie, he replied. Are you thinking about minor adjustments or major restructuring? Major restructuring, I said, and felt a strange sense of peace settle over me as I spoke the words. I want to completely change who inherits my estate. That's a significant decision, James said carefully. Can I ask what's prompted this change? I've realized that leaving money to someone just because they're related to you isn't necessarily the best way to honor the values you've spent your life building, I explained. I want my estate to go to people who will use it to create something meaningful, not just spend it on things they think they deserve. I see, James said, and I could hear him making notes. Do you want to discuss this over the phone, or would you prefer to come in for a consultation? I'd like to come in, I said. How soon can you see me? How about Wednesday afternoon? 2 o'clock? Perfect, I replied. And James? I want you to know that this isn't a decision I'm making impulsively. I've been thinking about this for a long time, and recent events have simply confirmed what I already knew. I understand, James said. We'll make sure everything is documented properly to reflect your wishes. After I hung up the phone, I sat in Harold's chair and looked out at the Williams house across the street. Through their front window, I could see Alex helping Emma with what looked like homework, both of them bent over books at their small kitchen table. Patricia was washing dishes, but she kept pausing to contribute to whatever they were discussing, the three of them clearly enjoying each other's company, despite the stress of their current situation. That evening, I began drafting a letter to Robert, trying to find words that would explain my decision without causing unnecessary pain. I wanted him to understand that this wasn't about punishment or revenge, but about choosing to support people whose values aligned with the ones Harold and I had spent our lives trying to embody. The letter went through several drafts before I felt satisfied with its tone. I wanted to be honest about my disappointment without being cruel, clear about my reasoning without being accusatory. Most importantly, I wanted Robert to understand that my love for him hadn't changed, but my willingness to enable his behavior had. By the time I went to bed that night, I felt more at peace than I had since Harold's death. For the first time in months, I was looking forward to tomorrow, not because I expected anything wonderful to happen, but because I was finally taking action based on my values rather than my fears. The decision to change my will wasn't about anger or spite. It was about recognizing that some people plant seeds while others simply consume fruit, and choosing to water the gardens that would bloom long after I was gone. Wednesday afternoon arrived with the kind of clarity that sometimes follows difficult decisions. I had spent Tuesday evening reviewing my financial documents, organizing bank statements and investment portfolios, preparing for what I knew would be one of the most important conversations of my life. The appointment with James Peterson wasn't just about changing legal documents. It was about taking control of my legacy and ensuring it would reflect the values Harold and I had spent decades building together. James Peterson's law office occupied the second floor of a restored brick building downtown, the kind of professional space that inspired confidence without intimidating clients. I had been coming here for nearly 20 years, first with Harold for estate planning and business matters, then alone after his death to handle the probate process. James had guided us through every major legal decision of our adult lives, and I trusted his judgment completely. "Maggie," James said, rising from behind his mahogany desk, as his secretary showed me into his office. "You look well. How have you been managing since our last meeting?" "Better than I expected," I replied honestly, settling into the familiar leather chair across from his desk. "I've been doing some serious thinking about what I want my legacy to represent." James opened a thick folder that I recognized as containing my current will and estate planning documents. "When we spoke on Monday, you mentioned wanting to make major changes to your beneficiary designations. Can you walk me through your thinking?" "I want to remove Robert as my primary beneficiary," I said directly, seeing no point in approaching the subject gradually. "I want to leave my entire estate to the Williams family instead." James set down his pen and studied my face with the careful attention of someone trained to recognize when clients might be making emotional decisions they would later regret. "That's a very significant change, Maggie. Can you help me understand what's motivated this decision?" Over the next hour, I told James everything. I described the birthday celebration that never happened, the pattern of canceled plans and broken commitments that had characterized my relationship with Robert for years, the growing realization that my son viewed me as an obligation rather than a treasure. I contrasted this with my observations of the Williams family, their genuine care for each other, their determination to face challenges with dignity rather than entitlement. "I've watched Patricia Williams work 2 jobs to support her children, while my son complains about having to visit me once a month," I explained. "I've seen Alex and Emma treat their mother with affection and respect, while my own grandchildren seem to tolerate my presence at best. I want my money to go to people who will use it to build something meaningful, not just spend it on luxuries they think they deserve." James listened without interruption, taking notes and occasionally asking clarifying questions about specific incidents or my relationship history with both families. His expression remained professionally neutral, but I could see him processing the information carefully. "Have you discussed this decision with Robert?" he asked when I finished my explanation. "Not directly," I admitted. I wanted to understand my legal options before having that conversation. "But, James, I need you to understand something important. This isn't a decision I'm making in anger or spite. This is about recognizing that some people grow stronger when they receive support, while others become weaker and more dependent." "Can you elaborate on that distinction?" "Patricia Williams would use financial assistance to build a more stable life for her family," I said. "She'd invest in education, in opportunities that would pay long-term dividends. Robert would use the same money to maintain a lifestyle he hasn't earned, to avoid facing the consequences of poor financial decisions he's been making for decades." James nodded thoughtfully. "From a legal standpoint, you have every right to dispose of your estate as you see fit. But I want to make sure you've considered all the implications of this decision, such as, Robert will almost certainly contest the will," James said bluntly. He'll claim undue influence, argue that you weren't mentally competent when you made these changes, possibly even suggest that the Williams family manipulated you into changing your estate plan. Then we'll need to make sure the documentation clearly demonstrates my competency and reasoning, I replied. What would that involve? James pulled out a legal pad and began making notes. First, I'd recommend a comprehensive mental competency evaluation by a qualified psychiatrist. This would establish your cognitive abilities and decision-making capacity at the time you executed the new will. Fine, I said. What else? We'd need to document your reasoning extensively, he continued. Detailed written statements explaining your decision, perhaps video testimony describing your relationship with both families. Evidence that this decision reflects a long-term pattern of thinking rather than a sudden emotional reaction. I can provide all of that, I assured him. We'd also need to be very careful about how we structure the bequest to the Williams family, James added. If Robert challenges the will, he'll try to paint them as opportunistic strangers who took advantage of a lonely widow. We need to demonstrate that your relationship with them developed naturally and that they never solicited financial support from you. The conversation continued for another hour as James outlined the legal framework necessary to protect my wishes from potential challenges. The process would be thorough and somewhat complex, but it was entirely feasible. More importantly, James seemed convinced that my reasoning was sound and my mental state was clear. There is one more thing I want to discuss, James said as our meeting was winding down. Have you considered leaving Robert anything at all? Sometimes a token bequest can actually strengthen a will by demonstrating that the testator didn't simply forget about family members. I thought about this carefully. What kind of token bequest? Perhaps some personal items with sentimental value, or a modest cash amount that acknowledges the relationship while making clear that the bulk of your estate is going elsewhere by deliberate choice. I like that idea, I said. I could leave him Harold's watch and maybe $5,000. Enough to show that I remembered him. Not enough to suggest he was my primary concern. That's exactly the kind of provision that tends to discourage successful will contests, James confirmed. It demonstrates deliberate intention rather than oversight or incapacity. As I drove home from James's office, I felt a profound sense of relief. The legal framework was in place to protect my decision, and I had a clear plan for moving forward. But I also knew that the most difficult conversation was still ahead of me. I needed to tell Robert about my decision, not because I owed him an explanation, but because I owed myself the honesty of direct communication. That evening, I called Patricia Williams and asked if she could come over for coffee. When she arrived, she looked more hopeful than she had on Monday morning, though still obviously stressed about her employment situation. I have some news, I told her as we settled in my living room with steaming mugs of coffee. I've spoken with my lawyer about helping your family, and I want to formalize the arrangement. Patricia's expression grew cautious. What kind of arrangement? I want to establish a fund that will cover your living expenses for the next year while you transition to better employment, I explained. But more than that, I want to make provisions for Alex's college education and Emma's music training. Maggie, that's incredibly generous, but I told you before that I can't accept. Let me finish, I interrupted gently. I'm not just talking about temporary assistance. I'm talking about changing my will to make your family my primary beneficiaries. Patricia's coffee mug stopped halfway to her lips. What? I'm leaving my estate to you and your children, I said clearly. The house, my savings, everything. I want it to go to people who will use it to build meaningful lives rather than just spend it on things they think they're entitled to have. Patricia set down her coffee cup with trembling hands. Maggie, I don't understand. We barely know each other. Why would you do something like this? Because in 8 months of being your neighbor, you've shown me more genuine care and respect than my own family has shown me in years, I replied. Because your children have treated me with kindness without expecting anything in return. Because you're the kind of people Harold and I always hoped we were raising Robert to become. What about your son? Surely he should inherit your estate. Robert will inherit what he's earned through his behavior toward me, I said, which is Harold's watch and $5,000. The rest will go to people who have demonstrated that they understand the difference between taking and giving. Patricia was quiet for a long time, staring into her coffee as if it might contain answers to questions she didn't know how to ask. "This is about your birthday, isn't it?" she said finally. "It's about much more than my birthday," I replied. "It's about 47 years of watching my son take my love for granted, of making excuses for behavior that consistently leaves me feeling unimportant and undervalued. It's about recognizing that blood relationship doesn't automatically create family bonds, but shared values and mutual respect do." "Have you told him about this decision?" "Not yet," I admitted. "I wanted to make sure the legal arrangements were solid before having that conversation. But I'll tell him soon." "He's going to be furious," Patricia said quietly. "Probably," I agreed. "But his anger will confirm that I've made the right decision. If he cared about me as a person, rather than as a source of inheritance, he would be concerned about my happiness rather than his financial prospects." Patricia stood up and walked to the window overlooking the street, her posture tense, with the weight of processing such life-changing information. "I need you to know something," she said without turning around. "My children and I have never discussed your financial situation or speculated about inheritance. We liked you because you were kind to us, not because we thought you might leave us money." "I know that," I said softly. "That's exactly why you deserve to inherit it." "What if we don't want it?" she asked, turning to face me. "What if accepting this inheritance feels like taking advantage of someone's family problems?" "Then you'll be the first people in history to refuse an inheritance for ethical reasons," I replied with a small smile. "But Patricia, this isn't about taking advantage of family problems. This is about recognizing and rewarding character. You've earned this through the way you live your life and raise your children." "I need time to think about this," Patricia said. "This is overwhelming." "Of course," I agreed. "Take all the time you need. But while you're thinking, consider what this could mean for Alex and Emma. Consider the opportunities they could have, the education they could pursue, the security you could provide them." After Patricia left, I sat in Harold's chair and tried to imagine his reaction to my decision. I thought he would approve, though he might have wished I'd recognized the truth about Robert's character years earlier. Harold had always believed that love should inspire people to become better versions of themselves, not enable them to remain selfish and entitled. The next morning brought an unexpected phone call from Linda, Robert's wife. She rarely called me directly, usually communicating through Robert or during brief conversations at family gatherings. "Maggie," she said, and something in her tone immediately put me on alert. "I hope you don't mind me calling, but I wanted to check on you after the birthday situation. Robert mentioned that you seemed upset when he talked to you on Sunday." "I'm fine, Linda," I replied carefully, though I was disappointed that the celebration didn't work out as planned. "About that," Linda said, and I could hear her taking a deep breath. "I need to be honest with you about something. Tyler's situation wasn't as serious as we made it sound, and Ashley's photography workshop was never rescheduled. The admission hung in the air between us like a confession." "Then why did you cancel?" I asked, though I thought I already knew the answer. "Because Robert didn't want to spend his Saturday afternoon at a family dinner," Linda said quietly. "He thought it would be boring, and the kids weren't particularly enthusiastic either. When Tyler got in minor trouble on Friday night, Robert saw it as a convenient excuse to avoid the celebration. The honesty was both shocking and validating. Here was confirmation of everything I'd suspected about my family's attitude toward spending time with me. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. "Because I feel guilty about lying to you," Linda replied, "and because I think you deserve to know the truth about how your family treats you. It's not right, Maggie. You're a wonderful grandmother, and we take you for granted. Does Robert know you're calling me?" "No," Linda said quickly. "He'd be furious if he knew I was telling you this. But I couldn't stand the thought of you blaming yourself for our behavior." The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Linda providing details about family discussions I'd never been privy to, decisions made about me without my input, attitudes that painted me as a burden rather than a beloved family member. It was painful information, but it was also liberating. I wasn't imagining the distance or misinterpreting their behavior. They really did view time with me as an obligation to be minimized, rather than an opportunity to be treasured. Linda, I said as our conversation was ending, I want you to know that I appreciate your honesty. It takes courage to admit uncomfortable truths. I just thought you should know, she replied. You deserve better than the way we've been treating you. After I hung up the phone, I made a decision that felt both difficult and necessary. I was going to call Robert that evening and tell him about the will changes. Not to hurt him or punish him, but to give him the opportunity to understand why I'd made this choice, and perhaps to motivate him to examine his own behavior. The conversation with Robert that evening was every bit as difficult as I'd anticipated. His initial reaction was disbelief, followed quickly by anger, then desperate attempts to negotiate or bargain. Mom, you can't be serious, he said when I explained my decision. You're talking about leaving our family's entire estate to people we barely know. I know them better than you think, I replied calmly. And more importantly, they've shown me who they are through their actions, not just their words. This is about the birthday party, isn't it? Robert said, his voice rising. You're punishing me for one canceled family dinner. It's not about one canceled dinner, I said. It's about a pattern of behavior that shows you value your convenience more than my feelings. Linda called me today and told me the truth about why you canceled. There was no family emergency, no rescheduled workshop. You just didn't want to spend time with me. The silence on Robert's end of the line stretched long enough that I wondered if he'd hung up. When he finally spoke, his voice was subdued. Linda wasn't supposed to tell you that. But she did, I said, and I'm grateful for her honesty, even though the truth is painful. Mom, I'm sorry about the birthday situation, Robert said, and for the first time in our conversation, he sounded genuinely regretful rather than defensive. You're right that we should have been honest with you, but changing your entire will seems like an extreme reaction. It's not a reaction, I corrected. It's a decision based on years of observation and consideration. I want my legacy to go to people who will use it to build something meaningful, not just spend it maintaining a lifestyle they haven't earned. The conversation ended with Robert promising to call me back after he'd had time to process what I'd told him. I suspected that when he did call back, it would be with threats of legal action or emotional manipulation designed to make me reconsider. But I also held on to a small hope that learning about my decision might motivate him to examine his own behavior, and perhaps work toward rebuilding our relationship on a foundation of mutual respect rather than one-sided obligation. That night, I slept more peacefully than I had in months. The truth was finally out in the open, the legal framework was in place to protect my wishes, and I had taken control of my legacy in a way that honored the values Harold and I had spent our lives trying to embody. Whatever challenges lay ahead, I was ready to face them with the confidence that comes from making decisions based on principle rather than fear. 3 months had passed since I'd signed the new will documents in James Peterson's office, and the changes had created ripples through my life that I was still learning to navigate. Robert had not called back as promised, but Linda had continued reaching out, seeming to understand that maintaining our relationship required someone to take responsibility for the damage that had been done. The legal challenges I'd anticipated never materialized, perhaps because James had done such a thorough job documenting my competency and reasoning. The psychiatric evaluation had confirmed what I already knew. I was making clear-headed decisions based on rational assessment of character and behavior. The video testimony I'd recorded explaining my choices would make it nearly impossible for anyone to claim I'd been manipulated or coerced. But the most remarkable changes had nothing to do with legal documents or family drama. They had to do with the way my daily life had been transformed by becoming part of the Williams family's orbit. Patricia had found a position as an accounting clerk at Henderson & Associates, the same building where James Peterson had his law practice. The job paid significantly more than her previous employment and offered health benefits that allowed her to stop working the exhausting evening cleaning shifts. With the financial support I'd provided during her transition, she'd been able to take refresher courses that updated her skills and made her competitive in the job market. Alex had thrown himself into his final year of high school with renewed focus, knowing that college was now a realistic possibility rather than a distant dream. He'd been accepted to the culinary arts program at the state university with a partial scholarship, and I'd assured him that the remaining costs would be covered. More importantly, he'd started working part-time at Romano's Italian restaurant, the same place Robert had taken me for those obligatory birthday dinners. The irony wasn't lost on me that Alex was learning to create beautiful meals for families to enjoy together, while my own son had viewed those same meals as burdens to be endured. Emma had begun taking voice lessons with Mrs. Crawford, the retired opera singer who lived over on Oak Street. Her talent was even more extraordinary than I'd realized, and Mrs. Crawford was talking about advanced training programs and scholarship opportunities that could lead to conservatory-level education. Emma's joy in her music was infectious, and sometimes when I heard her practicing in the evenings, I felt like Harold was sitting beside me, nodding his approval of how our money was being used. The three of us had developed traditions that felt more like family than anything I'd experienced in years. Sunday dinners at my house became a weekly celebration, with Alex cooking elaborate meals while Emma provided musical entertainment, and Patricia and I worked together on preparations. These weren't stilted obligation meals like the ones I'd shared with Robert's family, but genuine celebrations of shared affection and mutual support. Tyler and Ashley had come to see me exactly once since the will change, accompanied by Linda for what felt like a supervised visit. They seemed genuinely puzzled by their father's anger about my decision, and Tyler had surprised me by saying he thought it was cool that I was helping kids pursue their dreams. Ashley had asked thoughtful questions about Emma's voice training and seemed genuinely interested in supporting another young artist. The visit had made me sad for what might have been. My grandchildren weren't inherently selfish or entitled. They'd simply never been encouraged to think beyond their own immediate wants and needs. If Robert had raised them to value character over convenience, to appreciate opportunities rather than expect them, our relationship might have been entirely different. Robert himself had made his position clear through Linda, who served as an unwilling intermediary. He considered my decision a betrayal of family loyalty and an embarrassment to our community standing. He was convinced that I'd been manipulated by opportunistic strangers, and that I'd come to regret my choice. But he wasn't prepared to contest the will legally. Perhaps because James had made the challenges clear, or perhaps because he understood that a public battle would only validate my assessment of his character. The community response had been mixed, but mostly supportive. Some of my longtime neighbors seemed confused by my choice to support the Williams family over my own blood relatives. But others had observed the same contrasts in behavior that I'd noticed. Mrs. Chen from down the street had told me she thought it was wonderful to see young people who treated their mother with such obvious respect and affection. Frank Henderson had mentioned how impressed he was with Alex's work ethic and professional attitude at the restaurant. Dr. Martinez, who lived next door to the Williams family, had become an unexpected ally. As a pediatrician, she'd developed strong opinions about parenting styles and their long-term effects on children's character development. She'd observed both families over the months since the Williams had moved in, and she'd told me privately that she admired my decision to reward genuine family values rather than simply biological connections. But perhaps the most validating response had come from Pastor Brown at St. Mark's Church, where the Williams family attended services. He'd approached me after one Sunday service to tell me that my support had allowed Patricia to become more involved in church activities, that Alex had started volunteering in the community kitchen, and that Emma had joined the youth choir. My investment wasn't just changing their individual lives, it was strengthening their connection to the community and their ability to give back to others. The transformation in my own sense of purpose had been equally dramatic. For the first time since Harold's death, I felt like my life had meaning beyond simply existing from day to day. I was actively contributing to the development of two remarkable young people and supporting a mother who deserved every advantage I could provide. Instead of feeling like a burden that others tolerated, I felt like a valued member of a family that genuinely appreciated my presence. Emma had started calling me Grandma Maggie, without any prompting from her mother, and the natural affection in her voice when she used the title was worth more than any inheritance Robert might have provided his own children. Alex had begun asking my advice about college decisions and career planning, treating my opinions as valuable rather than outdated. Patricia included me in family decisions and celebrations, as if I'd always been part of their lives. The contrast with my relationship with Robert's family couldn't have been starker. where once I'd felt like I was constantly working to maintain connections that others found burdensome, now I was part of relationships that felt effortless and mutually rewarding. I wasn't trying to buy affection or attention. It was given freely because it was genuinely felt. One evening in February, as we sat around my dining room table after one of Alex's elaborate Sunday dinners, Emma surprised me with an announcement. "Grandma Maggie," she said, her eyes bright with excitement, "Mrs. Crawford thinks I'm ready to audition for the youth program at the Metropolitan Opera. She says my voice has developed enough that I might qualify for their summer intensive." The pride I felt was immediate and overwhelming. "Emma, that's wonderful. When are the auditions?" "Next month in New York," she replied. "Mom and I have been looking at travel costs and audition fees, and we think we can make it work." "You don't need to worry about costs," I said firmly. "This is exactly the kind of opportunity we've been preparing for. I want you to focus on your audition, not on money." Patricia's eyes filled with tears, as they often did when the full impact of our changed circumstances hit her. "Maggie, I don't know how we'll ever repay you for everything you've done for us." "You repay me every single day," I replied honestly. "By treating me like family, by including me in your lives, by letting me see Alex and Emma grow into the remarkable people they're becoming." Alex, who'd been quietly clearing dishes, paused in his work. "Grandma Maggie, can I ask you something?" "Of course. Do you ever regret your decision about the will? I mean, does it make you sad that your son is angry about it?" The question was more perceptive than I'd expected from a 17-year-old, but Alex had always shown wisdom beyond his years. "I'm sad about the relationship I have with my son," I said carefully. "But I'm not sad about the decision to support your family." Robert's anger confirms that he viewed me primarily as a source of future inheritance, rather than as a person he enjoyed spending time with. "That seems really lonely," Emma observed with the directness that made her such a compelling performer. "It was lonely," I agreed. "But I'm not lonely anymore." As spring arrived, bringing with it the promise of Emma's New York audition and Alex's graduation, I found myself reflecting on how completely my life had changed since that disastrous 75th birthday. The abandonment that had felt so devastating at the time had actually been a gift, forcing me to recognize truths I'd been avoiding for years. Robert's inability to prioritize my feelings over his convenience had revealed the transactional nature of our relationship. His anger about the will change had confirmed that his primary interest in maintaining our connection was financial rather than emotional. In trying to teach him that actions have consequences, I'd finally learned the same lesson myself. The Williams family had shown me what genuine affection looked like when it wasn't motivated by obligation or expectation. They'd demonstrated that family bonds are created through shared values and mutual respect, not through accidents of genetics. Most importantly, they'd given me the opportunity to use my resources in a way that honored Harold's memory and reflected the principles we'd tried to live by. Emma's audition in New York was successful beyond our wildest hopes. She was accepted into the youth program with a full scholarship and additional opportunities for private coaching with world-class instructors. Alex received early admission to his preferred culinary program with honors recognition that would open doors throughout his career. Patricia had been promoted to senior accounting clerk and was considering pursuing her bachelor's degree in business administration. As I watched their lives flourish with the support I'd provided, I felt a deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with gratitude or recognition. I'd made choices based on character rather than convenience, and those choices had created opportunities for extraordinary young people to reach their full potential. Robert never did call me back, but Linda brought Tyler and Ashley for occasional visits. The children seemed to understand that their grandmother had made a decision based on values they could respect, even if their father couldn't. Tyler had started working part-time at a local music store and mentioned that he'd like to learn more about classical technique from Emma. Ashley had developed an interest in food photography after seeing some of Alex's culinary presentations. On my 76th birthday, I woke up to the sound of Emma practicing scales in preparation for her upcoming performance with the youth opera program. Alex was already in my kitchen, preparing what he'd promised would be the most spectacular birthday breakfast I'd ever experienced. Patricia was arranging flowers she'd picked from her garden, flowers that would have rivaled any professional arrangement. The contrast with the previous year couldn't have been more complete. Instead of empty chairs and broken promises, I was surrounded by people who were genuinely excited to celebrate with me. Instead of feeling forgotten and unimportant, I felt cherished and valued. Instead of wondering whether my life had meaning, I could see the concrete evidence of how my choices were creating positive change in the world. As we gathered around the breakfast table that Alex had set with my wedding china, I realized that I'd finally learned the difference between being someone's obligation and being someone's choice. The Williams family had chosen me just as deliberately as I'd chosen them, and that mutual selection had created something infinitely more valuable than any inheritance could ever be. Harold would have been proud, I thought, watching Emma help Alex serve the meal while Patricia told stories that made us all laugh. He would have approved of the way our money was being used to nurture talent and character, to create opportunities, rather than enable entitlement. Most of all, he would have loved seeing me surrounded by people who treated love as a gift to be treasured, rather than a burden to be endured. Sometimes the most radical act of love is choosing to direct it toward people who will honor it rather than exploit it. Sometimes the greatest gift you can give yourself is the courage to stop enabling behavior that diminishes you, and start supporting people who help you become the best version of yourself. I'd started this journey believing I had nothing left to give, only to discover that I had everything to offer to the right people. The family that celebrated my 76th birthday wasn't the one genetics had given me, but it was the one my values had created. And that made all the difference. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.